Welcome to you all. Welcome to this BISA lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's a real delight today to be able to introduce our speaker, Eliana Hadjisavvas. Eliana, I'm very pleased to say, is the Alfred Landecker Lecturer at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism and in the School of Historical Studies here at Birkbeck. And she's is currently undertaking a 5-year funded research project on Jewish displacement and detention in the British Empire, with a special focus on Southern and Eastern Africa, and that is funded by the Landecker Foundation. Before coming to Birkbeck, Eliana was the postdoctoral fellow in Jewish history at the Institute of Historical Research here at the University of London, and she has also held fellowships in the United States. So it's with great expectation that I look forward, I'm sure we all look forward, to hearing Eliana speak today on detention and displacement throughout the British Empire, from the Irgun to the Mau Mau, 1945 to 1955. Eliana, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. I think we have a PowerPoint presentation as well. Thank you, Naomi. Great, thank you. Okay. So thank you, David, for the introduction. Just as a brief caveat, the dates 45 to 55, we're actually going to be going fast forwarding to 1958. So there's 3 years added to the initial period there. Okay, so in December 2022, a new television drama was released in Israel. Carthago is an 11-part series that chronicles the story of approximately 300 Jews who were interned in a British-run detention camp in Carthago, Sudan, in the 1940s. Accused of being suspected Jewish terrorists and members of the underground paramilitary organizations in Palestine, the Irgun and Lehi, these men were deported to sites around southern and eastern Africa. While the series was credited by the Jerusalem Post as a gripping production of an unknown part of Jewish history, elderly surviving detainees criticized the program for its inaccurate depiction of their story. Dramatizations of Jewish detention in the British Empire were famously projected on the silver screen in Otto Preminger's 1960 Hollywood classic Exodus, an adaptation of Leon Urey's American Zionist-inspired novel portraying the establishment of the State of Israel, which begins with Jewish refugees in detention camps in Cyprus at the end of the war. If we can have the first slide, please, Naomi. While popular audiences may have been introduced to the history of Jewish detention and displacement through Paul Newman's role as an aide in the Cyprus camps, the historiography on this subject has been defined by scholarly silences. Although over the past decade, histories of Jewish displacement in territories ranging from Cyprus to Mauritius, India, and Iran have revealed the transnational interconnections between the empire and narratives of both migration and detention, there remain significant gaps in our understanding of these periods. In my original research, which centered on the Cyprus detention camps, I was constantly coming across references to other sites of Jewish internment, particularly in southern and eastern Africa, from Uganda to Kenya, Tanganyika, present-day Tanzania, Nyasaland, present-day Malawi. The scope of Jewish displacement throughout the empire was unprecedented. It was from these original observations that I developed my second project, funded by the Alfred Landecker Foundation, which expands my previous work on the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East to Africa by adopting a global lens to analyze Jewish displacement in the empire more broadly. In my initial research on Cyprus, I considered references to other territories as unrelated, events that were happening simultaneously but elsewhere in the empire. But as my research has increasingly shown, while the map of Jewish displacement was vast, its narratives were interwoven and connected. So I want to spend the rest of this talk focusing specifically on the cases of Cyprus and Kenya, showing how these distinct histories and spaces of Jewish detention not only share theoretical and material commonalities, but form part of longer-term narratives of decolonization and the end of empire. Have the next slide, please, Naomi. The end of hostilities in 1945 saw millions of displaced persons repatriated to their homelands. However, for many Jewish DPs, desperate to escape the horrors of Nazi Europe and at times continued threat of persecution, Mandate Palestine was their only plan for sanctuary. Since 1921, Palestine had been administered by a British mandatory government that was keen to protect its interests in the Middle East by restricting mass Jewish immigration, which was vehemently opposed by Arab states. As intercommunal violence between Jewish and Arab communities increased in the interwar period, in 1939, the British government responded by implementing a white paper that capped the rate of Jewish immigration to Palestine at 75,000 over the next 5 years, with further admissions subject to Arab approval. In an effort to maintain Britain's geopolitical standing and bilateral relations with the Middle East, the end of the war in 1945 saw Britain uphold its restrictive immigration measures imposed under its 1939 White Paper, which refused to accommodate the overwhelming number of Holocaust survivors that now sought entry visas for Palestine, with visas capped at 1,500 a month. This led to many embarking on clandestine passages, with thousands of Jewish refugees crammed on small, unseaworthy vessels, braving the journey across the Mediterranean in an attempt to enter Palestine covertly. Have next slide, please, Naomi. As clandestine passages continued to increase, in order to deter future crossings and protect British interests in the region, following the escalation of hostilities against the mandatory government by Jewish paramilitaries in Palestine, in August 1946, Whitehall responded by ordering the internment of all visa-less Jewish refugees to camps in colonial Cyprus. Surrounded by barbed wire, armed watchtowers, and controversially constructed with the labour of German POWs from North Africa, the Cyprus camps were the largest detention operation for Jews in the British Empire. Between August 1946 to February 1949, approximately 53,000 Jews were detained on the island across 12 camps in the towns of Garaulos and Xilotlimbor, with over 1,500 children born. While initial estimates had predicted that a camp would be needed for no more than 10,000 refugees, as the Royal Navy continued to forcibly intercept ships, additional accommodation was increasingly needed. Whitehall officials looked out to the Empire for assistance. In a telegram to Governor of Kenya, Sir Philip Mitchell, in October 1946, the Colonial Office had inquired as to whether Kenya would be able to facilitate a detention camp for around 10,000 Jewish refugees, an overflow of those unable to be accommodated in Cyprus. For Mitchell, such a proposal was exceedingly unwelcome and would create great local opposition. Frankly, as Mitchell stated, I am, and I quote, unwilling to exhibit to the African population, which has had quite enough to digest already, these people who are, after all, the dregs of the ghettos of Europe. But Mitchell's prejudiced disapproval of housing the Cyprus refugees in Kenya was intertwined with another group of Jews, political detainees from Palestine. Since 1944, approximately 250 young men, suspected members of right-wing Jewish underground organizations, the Irgun and Lehi, were arrested and detained without trial in Palestine before being transshipped to detention camps, at first in Carthago, Sudan, before being moved to Asmara in Eritrea, and finally Gilgil in Kenya. Known as the period of African exile, these men, some as young as 15, were detained under Palestine Ordinance legislation and transshipped throughout the British Empire. While detained in Eritrea, security breaches and escape efforts made detention increasingly difficult for the military. As a result, Kenya was looked upon as an alternative location for the detainees. In his response to Whitehall, alongside his disapproval for interning Jewish refugees from Cyprus, Mitchell noted that the political detainees were equally as reprehensible and, I quote, as dangerous expert criminals and murderers should not be moved to Kenya. Mitchell's comments on the Jewish refugees and political detainees also concerned how they should be guarded. Violent disturbances amongst the detainees in Eritrea and guards had seen security increased. It was for Mitchell, and I quote, totally unjustifiable to deal with them, the detainees, by means of young African soldiers only. Instead, it was stated that reinforcements should be made by British Palestine police officers and European forces. Similar sentiment was shared with regard to the Cyprus refugees, with the suggestion that on account of the character of the immigrants, the camp's guards should be Europeans, as is the case with the Eritreans. The focus on the character of those interned captured the way racialized ideas of criminality played out, with the management of Jewish refugees and suspected terrorists not only interchangeable, but in requirement of experienced European servicemen. Concepts of whiteness were also discernible in the classification of European guards and reflective of racial hierarchical structures present in the military. The criminalizing of migrants as illegal, a political discourse that is still used in reference to contemporary displacement, largely evolved within British responses to Jewish refugees in the mid-20th century. As scholars such as Tony Kushner have shown, although the labelling of Jewish refugees as illegal formed the basis of the British government's official terminology, such designations were charged by a tradition of xenophobic and dehumanizing language. Identifying refugees as IJIs, illegal Jewish immigrants, homogenized their identity as a criminal collective, undermining their sense of agency and experience of forced migration as individuals. In a subsequent letter to Secretary of State for the Colonies, Arthur Creech Jones, Mitchell made clear his thoughts regarding the correlation between the refugees and political detainees, noting that, and I quote, "Your terrorists from Eritrea will be bad enough, and by no means an edifying example to the African people. I have had the advantage of hearing descriptions of the people now in Cyprus, and I can only say that to project that problem into this country too will be totally unjustifiable." Mitchell's classification of all Jews, whether refugee Holocaust survivor or suspected terrorist, within the same category, highlighted the continued prevalence of prejudice against Jews in the initial post-war period, which was seemingly as evident in the colonial periphery as much within the metropolitan centre. Next slide, please, Naomi. Although Whitehall eventually decided to keep the refugees in Cyprus by extending the camps on the island, in March 1947, the political detainees from Eritrea were sent to Kenya's Gilgil detention camp. I have to apologise for my terrible cartography skills, but I just wanted to offer, to give you all a map so you could see some of the geographical locations and the proximity of Cyprus to Palestine, obviously later Israel, and also if you can see the little flags that show where Nairobi and Cyprus on the second map. Next slide, please, Naomi. Kenya's Gilgil camp, like Garaulos in Cyprus, was structured as a military prison, accented with rows of double barbed wire fencing and military watchtowers, where armed British sentries stood guard. A military report from April 1947 detailed the condition of the camp, noting that while the structure was neat, it was difficult to, and I quote, find anything satisfactory to say about the camp. It appears to have been designed by someone who had no experience of such work and who knew that he would not have to live there himself. the report noted unsanitary conditions with an inadequate draining system, full latrines, and a fly-infested cookhouse that had already led to a number of the detainees becoming unwell with gastroenteritis. Despite the unfavourable living conditions, for the Jewish detainees now in Kenya, their detention continued much in the same way as in previous sites throughout the empire. In an effort to combat the mundanity of camp life, education became a key part of the detainees' daily routine. As several of the detainees were educated, learning was encouraged. The British authorities eventually permitted access to courses in which detainees could receive a diploma or, in the cases of younger prisoners, complete their schooling. But alongside learning and sporting activities, the detainees remained committed to preparing for their futures in an independent Jewish state. Through letter-writing campaigns, the prisoners penned their plight in articles for newspapers or requests for humanitarian assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross and United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the interned refugees in Cyprus were also preparing for their impending future and, like their imprisoned co-religionists in Kenya, used their detention as a platform to publicise their plight and wider aspirations for a Jewish state, an end to mandatory rule. Such instances demonstrated their agency as both migrants and political actors, as opposed to passive prisoners. Next slide, please, Naomi. While the two Jewish groups may not have shared a detention space on land, the high seas, however, were markedly different. In order to transfer the refugees from Eritrea, the naval ship Empire Hayward was used. The Empire Hayward had considerable experience for such operations. Since 1946, the ship had been used as a prison vessel, ferrying Jewish refugees, often detained in barbed wire cages, between Haifa in Palestine and Famagusta in Cyprus. The refugees had in the past protested against their treatment aboard the ship, condemning its features as a floating concentration camp. The Hayward's journey from Eritrea was seemingly no different, with an account from a political detainee aboard noting that they were handcuffed like common criminals and detained in holds below deck with little air. The Empire Hayward was not the only vessel used for transshipment of both the Cyprus refugees and Kenya detainees. HMS Ocean Vigour, which had been used since 1946 in transports from Cyprus, was also tasked with moving Kenya's prisoners throughout the empire. The Ocean Vigour, like the Empire Hayward, was just as militarised, defined by its use of wire cages to detain its passengers and space for soldiers to maintain order through armed guard. The utilisation of the Empire Hayward and Ocean Vigour for the transshipment of Jews in East Africa reveals the significant interconnections between British detention practices and policy throughout the empire, whereby material spaces of incarceration were repurposed to further Britain's imperial agenda. Following the establishment of Israel in May 1948, both the Kenya detainees and Cyprus refugees were eventually released, with the Kenya detainees arriving in Israel in July 1948 and the Cyprus camps closing in February 1949. When the Jewish detainees arrived at Gilgil in March 1947, the camp had been recently evacuated by another group of prisoners, Italian POWs who were captured during the British campaign in North Africa and detained in Kenya in the early 1940s. Next slide, please, Naomi. Correspondence from Italian POWs held at Gilgil, such as this letter sent in August 1946 from a prisoner named Antonio to his family in Italy, conveys the loneliness of detention, with Antonio pleading with his loved ones to keep in touch. But while Gilgil had hosted both Italian and Jewish prisoners in the 1940s, in the preceding years, its repurposing as a transit camp for Kenyan Kikuyu men, women, and children who were detained by the British as part of the Mau Mau uprising in the years 1952 to 60 would come to represent a darker chapter in the camp's history. Although Gilgil was only used in the early stages of the rebellion, between 1952 to 56, In that time, allegations made against the British government noted the camp's deplorable conditions, with reports of violence against detainees also referenced. Most notably, in January 1957, Philip Meldon, a former British officer who had worked as a rehabilitation officer in detention camps throughout Kenya, penned an expose on his experiences. Although stationed at numerous sites, Meldon's report on the Gilgil transit camp was soberingly bleak. Meldon had begun his duties at Gilgil in August 1954. A mixed transit site for men, women, and children detainees, Meldon noted that the conditions were appalling, with severe overcrowding, which saw women and children forced to sleep on bare stone or wooden floors, as the camp commander had reportedly refused them beds. The lavatories were also, as Meldon noted, I quote, mere pits in the ground that were overflowing. Security forces at Gilgil were also inadequate, with Meldon noting that 2 prison officers in particular detested African detainees and, I quote, spent their time shouting and kicking them, with Meldon concluding that neither of the officers, I quote, knew or cared for anything about the detainees. Upon speaking to a staff officer in charge of camps for the province, Meldon recalled that the former had defined Gilgil as an excellent camp with a first-rate commandant in charge. In view of these comments, Meldon claimed that he deemed it pointless to make a formal complaint at the time. In Whitehall, Meldon's expose had caused a political furore, with officials keen to establish facts and to dispel any claims of abuse and mistreatment against colonial authorities in Kenya. Military officials were called upon to offer their insights into both Meldon and his concerning claims. In a report from ACC Swan, who had been in charge of the Rift Valley province during Meldon's time at Gilgil, Swan outlined his objections to these accusations. On Gilgil, Swan noted that he had no recollections of the camp's conditions, sleeping quarters, or latrines. However, he went on to note that, and I quote, "The one thing that does stick in my memory is that the commandant of Gilgil camp was the brother of actor Victor McLaglen." While Swan's memories from Gilgil were evidently dominated by the famous familial connections of its commander, his opinion on Meldon was clear. "From what I remember," Swan continued, "Meldon was a constant thorn in the flesh and quarrelled with all his superiors. In turn, he was transferred from camp to camp." The allegations made against the treatment of detainees in Gilgil were, however, not the only claims of abuse troubling Whitehall officials. Across the empire in the Eastern Mediterranean, Garaulos camp in Cyprus had also been repurposed from its use as a military installation following the Jewish refugees' imprisonment in the 1940s to a detention camp for Greek Cypriot, EOGA, or National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, directly translated. Between 1955 to 59, British forces had led a violent counterinsurgency campaign against EOGA fighters, who were committed to ending colonial rule and achieving enosis, the political union of Cyprus with Greece. Detention quickly became a key feature of the British military's campaign against EOGA. Next slide, please, Naomi. In October 1958, Garaulos camp would once again be at the centre of debates amongst Whitehall policymakers. On the 3rd of October 1958, 2 women, wives of British Army officials, were shopping in the town of Famagusta. While admiring a shop window, the women were shot in the back by 2 assailants who quickly fled the scene. Mrs. Catherine Cutliff died, while her friend Mrs. Robinson was rushed to hospital with serious injuries, although she later survived. Next slide, please, Naomi. A mother of 5 and wife of a sergeant, Mrs. Cutliff's senseless murder caused an uproar amongst both the military and civil British communities in Cyprus. In retaliation, men within the Famagusta district were arrested and detained in an attempt to uncover the shooters. During these violent arrests, British servicemen attacked Greek Cypriots with reports of beatings. Once handcuffed and loaded into army vehicles, many of these men were taken to Garaulos camp. While there, witness statements detail attacks from British officers. In one such example, a Greek Cypriot named Hadjisavvas recalled being arrested and sent to Garaulos. He noted, and I quote, "As I alighted from the truck, the soldier hit me with a piece of wood many times on my head and my right arm. I fell down. As I lay there, he kicked me in the mouth, breaking 3 of my teeth," end quote. Once he regained consciousness, he awoke in a wire cage at the camp, where he pleaded for treatment by a doctor. While many such examples comment on the brutality of British servicemen in the wake of Cutliffe's murder, the killings of 2 young Greek Cypriot men, Andreas Luka and Panagiotis Chrysostomou, brought the reality of British detention policy to the fore. While the coroner in both cases failed to reach a conclusion in regard to who had inflicted the fateful injuries upon Luka and Chrysostomou, the coroner concluded that, and I quote, "It is obvious from the evidence that I have heard in this inquest that during those arrests or thereafter, there was used on some of those arrested a degree of force that would appear to be entirely unjustified. People were so assaulted and beaten that doctors were fully occupied at Garaulos camp." In light of the coroner's report, the Cyprus government agreed to compensate the families of Luka and Chrysostomou, as well as the district of Famagusta, for damages to properties and local buildings. While Garaulos was not used as extensively during the EOGA campaign as it had been during the period of Jewish detention in the 1940s, which at a time held over 20,000 people, the camp's repurposing, like that of Gilgil, as sites of imprisonment and violence, reveals the way these often silenced narratives of Jewish experiences throughout the empire were entwined within the history of decolonization. Cyprus and Kenya would both eventually achieve their independence and freedom from colonial rule in 1960 and 63, respectively. But what can these historical pasts tell us about the histories of detention, displacement, and empire? In 2002, a BBC article by journalist Martin Plaut, entitled "Britain's Guantanamo," chronicled the story of the Jewish detainees in Africa and noted the imprisonment of Yitzhak Shamir, who in the late 80s became Prime Minister of Israel. Despite the status of some former inmates, the Gilgil camp had largely been forgotten within the historiography of this period. As noted, Gilgil's notoriety would come some years later, following its repurposing in the 50s as a transit camp during the infamous Mau Mau uprising. In an interview with a surviving Jewish detainee from the Gilgil camp, he remembered his experiences as a 15-year-old prisoner, transshipped from Palestine to these unknown and unfamiliar sites across the empire. In 2009, he returned to Kenya with a group of former prisoners and their relatives for a documentary on their story. He recalled, and I quote, "The Kenyans were very happy to see us. They said that we had inspired them to be strong against the British. We were like the Jewish Mau Mau." To be absolutely clear, neither the former detainee nor the Mau Mau veteran he connected with were suggesting in any way that the experiences of the Jewish political detainees and Mau Mau prisoners were equivalent. But their exchange reflected a form of common anti-colonial sentiment that was translated through the shared detention space both resided in a decade apart. While the case of Jewish refugee and political detainee internment in Cyprus and Kenya are both rich chapters in their own right, viewing these 2 case studies consecutively graphically highlights the interconnections between the detention of Jews and empire. As evidenced in the years that followed, colonial administrators and military officials would go on to employ the tactics they developed interning Jews in spaces throughout the British Empire in violent counterinsurgency campaigns, and most notably, as we've seen, in Kenya and Cyprus. Today, both the Gilgil and Garaulos sites remain military camps. Gilgil in Kenya as an army barracks, and Garaulos as a Turkish base in occupied northern Cyprus. Last slide, please, Naomi. The last decade has seen survivors of the Mau Mau and Eoga insurgencies compensated by the British government for historic abuses inflicted by the colonial administrations in the 50s and 60s. The legal proceedings, unsurprisingly, failed to mention the longer histories of detention at these sites and role played by Jews in the years preceding their Kenyan and Cypriot detainee counterparts. But as has been seen, spaces of detention were linked and continually evolving to further Britain's imperial programme. Jewish experiences throughout the British Empire must therefore be understood not as insignificant moments of liminal migration or detention, but as integral histories within the legacies of empire and decolonisation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliana. That was completely fascinating and interesting how you connect these different different narratives through the empire. So I think, and clearly that's one way of doing it. But one thought that I had as you were speaking was, to what extent is this a story about empire, or to what extent is this a story about what states do? And your mention of Guantanamo partly brought that to mind. I mean, in other words, when faced with illegal immigrants, states often detain them. When faced with insurgents, states lock them up. And so it raises a question of what is specific about British policy in this period, and how might one get a handle on that. And I suppose one way in which we might do that is through thinking about what other states are doing at the same time, what, for example, the French are doing. That might be one way of doing it. Or another way of doing it, which speaks perhaps more to the more immediate work which you're doing now, is as you go through the archive, do you find any sort of alternative policies being, alternative responses being pondered by politicians and civil servants, which would give one some sort of purchase or historical purchase on why these choices are being made?
Yeah, thank you, David. And those are all really, really great questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. So I think in terms of when we're considering empire more broadly and detention practices, of course, you're absolutely right that detention and especially, you know, I mean, not just obviously in Britain, but abroad, it's a very pertinent and popular issue at the moment, this idea of managing those deemed undesirable by detaining them in an offshore location is something that is, of course, still happening today. The Guantanamo reference, which in the context that I spoke of, is from an article in 2002. Of course, Guantanamo, today in January, President Trump obviously announced that he wanted to reopen Guantanamo and you know, reinstate it as a site of detention. So we've sort of seen that repurposing and come full circle in real time. I think, though, in terms of Jewish history and the sort of wider histories of the Holocaust and refugees, it's really about understanding how these narratives are positioned within the history of empire. I think so often when we consider Jewish experiences or Jewish narratives within the empire, they're never considered within these sort of global narratives. It's always about thinking about these Jewish people, whether obviously in the case I presented today, you have these Holocaust survivors in Cyprus and these political detainees in Palestine. But they're often looked at completely separately and within that particular space and moment, without any kind of connection to the broader and longer term narratives. And I think what my original research on Cyprus and what I'm doing now really tries to show is that actually if you place these histories not on their own as these sort of independent, unrelated, unconnected issues, but within these sort of wider concepts, you can see the sort of depth of Jewish history in a real way, and really making those global connections as sort of as Jewish history as world history, if you like. I think in terms of British policy and this idea of alternative policies, I think it's also really important to note that the way that this policy evolves is very much on the job. I think sometimes people have these sort of wider ideas that these are, in-depth plans that the British have had for years, whereas actually all of this is very much evolving in real time. So, for example, the construction of the Cyprus camps, I always remember an interview with a British serviceman who claims that he received this telegram while he was playing tennis, on a Sunday afternoon in Cyprus, and was suddenly told that you need to construct these camps. And they were constantly back and forth. Officials, not only in the metropolitan centre in Whitehall, but also within the colonial periphery, discussing what we should do. The Cyprus plan was on the table back and forth throughout the 1940s. It was only in 1946 that they actually went forward as this being at that time the most appropriate plan to go ahead with. And in the case of the political detainees in Palestine, they had been detained in Palestine in the Latrun prison camp in the years preceding their shipment to Africa. So there are certainly sort of alternative policies within these narratives as well.
Thank you. I should have invited people to raise their virtual hands. Your virtual hand, if you have a question. Ben, yes.
Hi, thank you, Eliana. It was such a interesting talk, and obviously I couldn't help but constantly be thinking about the echoes of today's hostile environment and war on terror. But I wanted to ask about, I was really struck by the colonial Mitchell, they're talking about the dregs of the ghetto and kind of framing that in a apparent concern for the people of Kenya, not having to deal with, who dealt with enough already, and not wanting to have to deal with these the dregs of the ghetto as well. But do you know, like, was that concern, was he talking about the Black majority population, or was he talking about like white settlers? Why did he think they would have a particular issue with, I mean, was it just sort of his racism, or is there any kind of particular reason that he kind of was expressing that concern?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So within the sort of wider context of this correspondence that goes back and forth, it's very much based on the sort of wartime experience of Kenya. Kenya had been a place where there had been, lots of prisoners of war. Obviously, I mentioned the Italians, and was in sort of really dire situation at the end of the war. Economically. There was obviously also these concerns with regards to, the end of empire and decolonization looming, that Mitchell wasn't willing to suddenly kind of transfer the Palestine problem, if you like, over to Kenya. But I think it's important to note as well that Mitchell himself, I mean, is noted to have been obviously racist, and to use this sort of very xenophobic language against lots of different minority communities. And whilst in that particular correspondence that I viewed in the archive, his racism is towards Jews, he of course had very similar xenophobic feelings about most minority communities. But in this context, obviously, it's more this sort of worry and concern about transferring the Palestine problem and sort of Palestine-related issues to Kenya.
Thank you. And let's take a couple at a time now. First of all, Daniel Ben-Ami, and then Martin Plaut.
Yeah, just a question in the spirit of, excuse me, relating the broader concepts you talked about to your very specific research. Do you think the British saw the Jewish political prisoners from Lehi and Etzel, or the Irgun and the Stern gang, as part of an anti-colonial insurgency, just as the Mau Mau in Kenya was an anti-colonial insurgency in Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There was this fear of, and I mean, I think it's also important to note that for the British, these people were very much defined as Jewish terrorists. And actually, you see in the correspondence after Israel is established in May 48, the Kenya detainees, I mean, it would be a whole paper in itself in terms of what happens in that period before they are then released and sent back to what obviously then became Israel in they arrive in July 48. There is this real worry about what happens if we allow these terrorists back into the new Jewish state. And actually, because these people were also right wing, politically right wing, there were these concerns as well, not just with regards to the threat to British lives, and as obviously the British were packing up and leaving Palestine, but also within sort of the wider Yishuv and Jewish community in Palestine, that actually liberal Jewish groups wouldn't necessarily want these, very sort of right-wing groups returning. So yeah, absolutely, there was this feeling of this sort of anti-British, anti-colonial sentiment amongst these groups, and there was this fear and sort of defining of them as terrorists and gangsters and murderers. That was very much how the British defined them.
Martin Plaut.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you. I just wanted to, and I heard this suggestion that that Ben Gurion and the Haganah had cooperated with the British in providing the names of those that were eventually deported to Africa. I wondered whether there was any truth in this, or whether this was the result of British intelligence, that they knew who they were. Because I mean, the story I heard was that the British didn't really know who the heck was in the Irgun and Lehi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Martin, and thank you for also writing the BBC article that I referenced in 2002, because it's been a great help to me. So in all honesty, that's not a reference that I've come across in terms of, I mean, informants. There were certainly informants, and there was this, very much lots of kind of clandestine activity involved in within the wider context of the Irgun, and especially with regards to detention. For example, escape efforts, as you know very well yourself, from Eritrea and then later in Kenya. Although the Kenyan escape movement actually is successful, the failed escape movements in Eritrea, there are certain informants that end up informing the British of Jewish movements, and that's the reason why their escape plans from the Eritrea camp are foiled. So I can't say that I specifically know about this Ben Gurion case, but certainly within the wider context, informants and sort of clandestine activity was at the heart of this movement for sure.
Thank you.
Michael Berkowitz.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting paper, and it's actually related to the previous question. And to what extent do you have information about the about these detainees, about these prisoners themselves? And one of the reasons why I ask is in the specific case of Yitzhak Shamir, that is, he not only took action against the British, but he attacked my former head of department, from UCL, that is, Shimon Abramsky, was literally attacked in Jerusalem and hospitalized for months as he was attacked by Yitzhak Shamir. So I think that there probably were a number of cases which were actually quite complicated, which is not to say, that it's, justified to send them, to some camp outside of the country. But I think that we still don't have as complete a picture as we might have about what actually happened between these different groups. And I think that it wasn't until my colleague told me about this, I think in 2007, that he had never written about it, but it was something that was incredibly traumatic, and it didn't seem to be isolated. Anyway, leave that. But thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. That's a really interesting point, and obviously not something that I was aware of. I mean, I think within the wider context, certainly, I mean, there's only so much I can obviously present in sort of half an hour window, but of course, actually, the personal stories and the narratives of who these individuals were is definitely part of the sort of wider project, as well as the refugees in Cyprus. I mean, oral history has always been a key methodology for me, alongside deep archival research. And I was fortunate enough to interview one of the last detainees from Gilgil, who unfortunately passed away a few months ago, but also second generation family members, the sons and of former detainees, to try and understand their backstory and who they were and how they sort of ended up within this context. I think it's really important to note as well that, of course, I mean, Yitzhak Shamir is one example, but many of these men go on to play really key roles in the state of Israel, either as judges within the political system. In some cases, they have high up roles in the IDF or Mossad, and so they're sort of the legacy, I guess, of their fight for the state sort of continues in their involvement then as citizens. So, I mean, I can't obviously comment too much about sort of specifics, but certainly to really understand the context of all of this, the political context is just one side of it. At the heart of it are people, be it refugees or political detainees, not only obviously in the context of the Jewish narratives, but also the detainees later in the cases of the Eoga veterans and Mau Mau veterans in Cyprus and Kenya.
Thank you. We have just 12 minutes left, and there are 3 people with their hands up. So I think we should take all 3 questions and comments at once to ensure that everyone is able to speak, and then allow Eliana to respond. So first of all, Laura Almogor. Hi, Laura.
Hi, good to see you both. Very good to see you, Eliana, and great to hear where you're at with your research at the moment. That was really interesting and inspiring. So my question pertains to kind of the Jewish perspective in all of this. So you shared this anecdote of kind of a later meeting between a former detainee and a Mau Mau veteran, where there is this kind of direct connection made at that point, so post factum, in relation to the actual space, about the connection between kind of the Jewish experience and the later decolonial experience, if you can group the Mau Mau case under that. So I was just wondering to what extent in your archival findings, but maybe even more so in your interviews with former detainees, you see kind of a Jewish engagement with the Jewish place on kind of the racial spectrum, especially for the Kenyan case. To what extent are Jews actually consciously reflecting on their own whiteness or off-whiteness, or in any case, their place on that spectrum between white and non-white, and also what their experience does to kind of an understanding of the Jewish engagement with the process of decolonization? Does this come up? And if not, what do you make of that?
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Yitzhak Kerem. Yitzhak, are you there? Can you unmute, Yitzhak?
Yes. I've researched legal immigration for about 45 years. Okay. So you should see a lot of my publications, especially in Hebrew. this isn't a polar story. It's not right-left exactly, okay? And it's not Ashkenazi, Sephardi. Okay, so Lehi, for example, was very political, but it also was left and right. It was definitively anti-colonialist, okay? And Jews who had no place in the pecking order because they came from Arab or Muslim lands went to Lehi and Etzel because they were more accepted. Okay, so and then Israel had in the illegal immigration movements, you could call it a civil war. Okay, it was patterned after the British hunting season. Okay, so movement had kidnapped and mass arrest many revisionists. Okay, and even killed them. But there were it wasn't. It isn't the Haganah verse collaborated against each other, but it is true that the Haganah reported hundreds of rightists to the British, okay, and usually not vice versa, and there are many different issues here, okay, and even the Jewish activists, it plays out in Cyprus between the labor movement and the revisionists, even into the after World War II. That's not very well known. Okay, but there are many things to analyze. And it's not just a simple polar analysis between right and left.
Thank you.
That's all, and I hope to be in touch with you in the future.
Thank you very much, Yitzhak. Eva Turner.
Thank you very much. I have a slightly different question. I wanted to ask you, the British had already camps in Palestine. They had Atlit, they had Sarafand, and in view of them not particularly wanting to transfer the Palestinian problem abroad, why did they take this particular group to Kenya and other places? And my second half of the question is, thinking of Rwanda and the way the population in Britain have rallied against the Rwanda decision, was there any comeback from, say, the Jewish population in Britain against that?
Thank you, Eva. Eliana, you have the last words.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, thank you for that collection of questions. I'll go through in order. So, Laura, lovely to see you, and thank you so much for your really insightful comments and question. Right, so archival findings, process of decolonization. So I think it's important to note that in the case of Cyprus specifically, obviously this wasn't the focus of the talk today, but you very much have this anti-colonial rapport and movement that develops between Haganah paramilitaries that end up covertly infiltrating the Cyprus camp, specifically to help people escape, and their connection with Cypriot leftists who are part of the Cypriot Communist Party, AGEL. So this is something that's a really key part of the Cyprus story, and obviously, as Greek Cypriot descent, if anyone's wondering where my funny surname comes from, I interviewed a lot of people with not only sort of surviving internees who were part of these movements and former Haganah members, but also local Cypriots who were involved in these escapes. So you definitely have these sort of anti-colonial connections and this perceived hope that if we help each other and we support each other now, that once we're both independent, perhaps we can have a friendly political bilateral relationship in the future. So certainly in the case of Cyprus, that exists. In terms of the Kenyan experience, actually what you see because obviously the Kenya detainees are first in Sudan and then in Eritrea. You actually see in Eritrea that there's a very violent incident where Sudanese guards shoot at the detainees, and 2 actually die and lose their lives. And this is perceived as a sort of racialized attack because these guards are Muslim, and this is part of the reason why the British then make this decision to remove African soldiers from guarding these refugees, these detainees, sorry, in Eritrea. And you can see in some of the correspondence that comes out of the Eritrean example that the Jews very much, in terms of their kind of racialized ideas of these, Africans who had attacked them, you definitely see those kind of, racialized, that sort of racialized narrative within that context. In terms of, of course, this isn't a polar argument, and it's complex, and there's lots of different political processes and underpinnings to it. I would say that it's important to note, though, that whilst, yes, you had different political opinions and political agendas amongst these people, the way that they are, especially within Palestine/Israel itself. I mean, in interviews that I conducted with some of the surviving members, second generation members, they do feel aggrieved that this story has sort of been lost within the wider narrative, arguably until the Carthago TV series in 2022 really brought it to the fore. And from their perspective, part of that is because of the right-wing ideology that some of these members had. And then finally, to end with, yes, you're absolutely right, Ava. There were camps in Palestine, at Lit camp most notably, where many of the Cyprus refugees ended up actually doing a stint once they had been transferred from Cyprus. In terms of the Kenya narrative, why did they go to Kenya? So actually, in a lot of the reports after the Kenya detainees are sent to Israel and the camps are closed, British policymakers, when asked this question, commented that there was actually this fear that if they kept these people who were perceived as sort of very dangerous terrorists and insurgents in Palestine, that they may actually be freed from their sort of compatriots who are outside and beyond the wire. So that was one of the reasons at the heart of why actually they decided if we remove them and send them to an offshore location, there'll be less of a threat to British lives and communities in Palestine. I think that's about it.
Well, thank you so much, Eliana, and perfectly timed. All that remains is for me to thank everyone who has come and to this presentation, especially to those who have contributed, but above all to you, Eliana, for this really richly researched a presentation, which I think has offered an important perspective on these years, both for imperial and also, as you underlined, for Jewish history, and also for giving us a sense of how much more is to come from your project. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.